Riaz, welcome to Diaspora Food Stories. How are you this evening, I guess, over there in London?
I'm fine, thanks. It's gotten a bit cold, but we're maintaining. We're used to it by now.
Awesome, awesome. Well, I'm excited to have you join us today, talk about your work that you're doing there in the United Kingdom, as well as throughout the Caribbean, so that we can just give our listeners a little bit more into how this all came about, and then also dig into some of your recent book, East Winds. So, you know what I like to do with these interviews for anyone that follows us is I like to go back to the very, very beginning and how it all began, because it did begin somewhere. So I know,
Mm.
born and raised in London. Tell me about that growing up. I know you come from a Caribbean family, so share some of those memories with us if you don't mind.
Yeah, I come from I'd say like a mixed heritage Caribbean family. A lot of times in Britain, Caribbeanness gets kind of homogenized into this one idea
Mhm.
when the islands in different countries are so drastically different from each other.
Right.
So the majority of my family were from Jamaica, but a lot of them were also from St. Vincent, as well as Guyana and also Trinidad and Tobago.
Mhm.
When I say family, I mean in the sense of like kind of typical for Afro-Caribbean families, which were like people who aren't necessarily aunties and uncles and cousins, but they might as well be because of just how familiar they are and how close
Mhm.
they are and how much you grew up with them. And so for the older generation of my family, just their Caribbeanness was just so ingrained in their everyday
Mhm.
culture and everything they did every day in terms of what they ate and the music that they
Right.
listened to, that growing up there was actually just like no such thing as Caribbean food or
Mm.
Caribbean music to me. It was just what there was just food.
Mm.
And so it wasn't until I kind of grew up to the age of like primary elementary school, when I went to a school where there was only maybe four or five other kids from the Caribbean, predominantly white school, that I realized that the food that I'd been growing up eating was this kind of other food, this kind of
Mm.
alien food. And I realized it was so different to what everybody else had been eating.
How did that make you feel? Did you feel like I need to start to eat some other food, or did it sort of say, you know what, I'm okay with this?
Um, I mean, I do recall at a young age having that hankering for McDonald's and pizza and things. I think that's just kind of kid nature rather than a kind of outward nature of being inside a British community
Hmm.
and system. But actually, I remember feeling a lot of pride from a young age, weirdly,
Good.
and also me and the other Caribbean kids who would come in with leftover hardo bread and curry goat and plantain. It was kind of like our secret club, and
Oh.
we would share our pride in the fact that kind of nobody else knew about the foods that we ate, and the fact that our sandwiches tasted and smelled and looked so much better than all the other kids' cucumber and ham sandwiches.
I love that. I love that. So who was cooking at home? Who were some of those memories there?
Oh, my mum and my grandma.
Okay.
So that was my mum and my dad's mum. So those were the two people I spent the most time with growing up. And
Wow.
so it wasn't it wasn't something that they did every day, but a lot of times the foods that they cooked, even if it was just a regular kind of European dish like a lasagna or shepherd's pie or something, it would still have like yams and cassava and plantain or green banana on the side. And that's something that kind of they always did. Or it was your Sunday dinner, which would be a bigger Caribbean cook up.
Mhm.
And then you'd have the leftovers of that throughout the week. Or especially midweeks, you'd have kind of chicken soup, brown stew chicken, those kind of rich meals, that one pot meals that you kind of cook once and it feeds a couple people for a couple of days.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, those are the main memories I have of the food growing up.
Wow. Now, I always like to go into this. So, for some people, food is sort of a permanent fixture in their mind, right? As they're growing up. And some for others, it's maybe, following a different career path, and then food re-enters at a later time. Where would you say you were as you were sort of progressing through childhood, youth into adulthood?
Yeah, definitely. As I got older, 17, 18 plus, it's definitely something that kind of slipped to the back of my mind in terms of I wouldn't say how much I desired it, but I would just kind of when you're that age, you're at college, going into work, you're kind of sustaining on literally what you can afford and what you can make yourself. And you're kind of so engrossed in thinking that your studies is the end of the world, and there's only like limited capacity you can have for other things. And so I definitely didn't think anything remotely deep about the food of what
Okay.
I'd been eating growing up, until I kind of started this more recent journey, maybe about 5 years ago.
Wow, wow. So let's go into, when you were studying post high school, what was the career path that you wanted to go in, or did you always want to be a writer and do and a documenter?
Um, Not necessarily. I'm not sure I would say I don't like to say typical ever,
Mm-hmm.
but I feel like I come from a kind of genre of typical Afro-Caribbean African family, which is you kind of go to school, you make sure your grades are right, you go to college, you do a postgraduate degree at college, and then you get a good solid job, and then that's the end of the story in a way.
Right.
Um, and so I did all of that until I got the job, and I lasted about 2 years before I kind of realized I wasn't cut out for that world.
Right, right. So then tell us about how your journey as a writer started.
Well, I mean, I really did enjoy uni, school, and when I started working, a lot of the work I did was in research and support. To cut a long story short, it was just data gathering, information gathering, source citation, data collection, all the stuff I'd basically been doing at school and postgraduate school. And that work I inherently did actually really love doing all that stuff, collecting data, checking data points against each other, formulating debates and arguments. It just happened that I didn't really love who I was doing it for and the
Okay.
topics of what we were doing. It was kind of
Hmm.
meaningless to me in a way. It was it was just a kind of it was just a profiteering exercise to say the least.
Right, right.
And so to get into kind of where we are now, as I mentioned, yeah, that I always thought if I was doing this research and all these things that I'm doing now for something I truly like cared about,
Hmm.
then I would probably love it. And it just so happened at the time that I was already sort of mentally winding down from the work I was doing. My grandma passed away,
Okay.
and so for all the times that she'd cooked, for all the times that I had watched her kind of go to the market, it's called Wrigley Road Market. It's like a famous Afro-Caribbean migrant market in East
Mm,
London,
okay.
and I remember she had cancer in her leg and she had a walking stick, and she would still make an effort to walk to the bus stop, get on the number 30 bus from Homerton down to Ridley Road Market, and make sure that she always bought her yams and her green bananas and the plantain and the
Mm,
cassava and dasheen. And yeah, she pretty much did that until her last week with us. And
wow.
so that always stuck in my mind. But as a youngin, I find this quite interesting when I talk to people from other diasporas around the world, that there are older people maybe dealing with some kind of inner trauma or something, tended to shield the experiences that they went through when they were younger, when they first came to these countries. They tended to not talk about it with us. You didn't really tend to have too many like adult conversations. And so, yeah, it was kind of obviously when she passed away, I realized I'd never really be able to ask her about why she was always cooking this food, why she was so kind of determined to walk to the market
Hmm.
and get this food and continue cooking it, because at a point it can't just be because it tastes good or you like the taste. There has to be a deeper meaning to why it's so important for you to carry on the legacy of this food.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so a lot of kind of different strands ran simultaneously. At the same time, there was a number of books coming out in the UK, books about London food and East London food and British food. And I found that time and time again, they always omitted the stories of Caribbean
Mm,
people in the communities. And
yeah.
I knew from just being around, always going to like these shops, how important they were for the communities. And additionally, as I mentioned, I have a mixed heritage Caribbean
Right.
family. So I always understood that the Caribbean is so diverse that even if these books had like included one token story, that wouldn't have been enough really for me to kind of tell the full diversity of like British Caribbean stories in the UK, not just in London, but in other cities like Manchester,
Mm-hmm.
Birmingham, Liverpool, that have really rich, strong Caribbean heritage that goes back decades, almost like a century now.
Right. Right.
So yeah, just couple that with the fact that I had kind of already been well versed in research methods from my postgraduate degree. I just kind of naively and arrogantly assumed that I could just write a book about what I've been thinking about and it would be published. But yeah, fortunately, my delusions came true.
Wow. So then you published your first book, right? Yourself.
Yeah, so I tried to go down the traditional route of like finding an agent
Mm-hmm.
and getting it published. Um,
What were the responses? I'm curious. Although I probably know, but I'm just curious. What were some of the responses, if you got
yeah, so
any?
I mean, yeah, exactly. The few that I did get were just not seeing like commercial viability in the project.
Right.
And the rest, it was just like too slow. That was the thing for me. It was just too slow. There was like getting feedback, trying to get meetings. The whole process was just way too slow for me. I had the idea, and I'd been very inspired by like friends who were working in TV and music with the way that when they had ideas, they could just rent a studio and record their tunes, or they could rent camera gear and just make their pilots.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a time that kind of crowdfunding had just become a thing. So websites like Kickstarter.
Mm-hmm.
So just seeing all that, I just thought between that and the kind of new wave of social media that had just started at the time. Initially, I'd been using a website called Tumblr.
Okay. Yep.
Um, and then one day my friend came and he was like, hey, you need to check out this new website called Instagram.
Good
And
old Instagram.
yeah. And so, yeah, then I just posted on that. And I had at the time, I had about 700 followers on Instagram.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was loads. And I think, and actually, I still do think it is low. I think people are so, I mean, it's a different conversation, but I think people are so kind of awestruck by the millions and hundreds of thousands that they
Yeah.
see that they forget if you had an idea and you wanted to go tell 700 people on the street how long that would take you to sell your idea to 700 people on the high street. It would take you about a month to get
Nice.
700 people who want to listen to you. But here you've already got this like group of people who are already engaged in the type of story you want to tell.
Right.
And I kind of had an idea that that would be enough to sustain. But fortunately, I'd gone to school with somebody who worked at a news company and they had seen what I was doing and pitched it to the editor and they liked the idea. And I was able to get on TV within like a week of making the crowdfund.
Mm-hmm.
And then, yeah, and then the day I was on TV, we hit the goal.
Oh, nice. Nice. So you
And
discovered that, you know what, if no one is going to sign on to tell these stories, I'm going to find the medium to tell these stories myself.
yeah, because at the end of the day, it's all just monetary. When an editor tells you that they don't see commercial viability in the story, that just means that they don't want to put money into it.
Right.
So and that's if you know that there's an audience for these stories and you can get that funding a different way, then that's it really.
Yeah.
The age that we're in now, you can get your own graphic designer, you can get your own editor, you can get your own colorist, you can get anything. And additionally, that allowed me to kind of keep it in the family. I hired a Jamaican graphic designer who was fresh out of school as well, and she'd never designed a book before. But I was like, if you can design magazines, I'm sure you can design a book. I
Mm-hmm.
had another Jamaican Australian artist make the typeface for the book. Um, I had another Caribbean lady who edited it. Um, and yeah, that was it, really.
Wow. Wow. So let's sort of talk about each book because you're covering, as you said,
Mhm.
with being so diverse with your heritage. You go from Jamaica and then you slowly come down to eventually hit Guyana, Trinidad, and Suriname which is a
Mhm.
country that, many people don't necessarily know too much about. But so what was the vision that you said, what, these behind the stories that you wanted to tell? What was that vision inspired by your grandmother?
Well, I think that vision was more inspired by my whole entire family.
Okay.
So West Winds was predominantly about Jamaica. And of course, when I made that book and told my family about it, the other side of my family were just like, hello, what about us? Like, we exist as
Yeah.
well.
Mm-hmm.
And that was always the goal from the beginning, to kind of paint this picture of the kind of heritage that I grew up in,
Mm-hmm.
this kind of mixed Caribbean heritage. Something that really only exists in places like South and Central Florida, London, New York, and Toronto, where you have these alignments and these shared cultures of Caribbeanness. Because, like, whenever I do a presentation in England, I always start off by asking people to put their hands up if they've eaten Caribbean food.
Mm-hmm.
And then I ask them to name me the Caribbean foods that they've eaten. And the answers are always the same, like jerk chicken, rice and peas, ackee and saltfish.
Right.
And those are overwhelmingly Jamaican foods. And so if you go to a place like Guyana, you're not going to find any of those foods that I just mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
And vice versa, the foods that they're eating in Guyana, like roti, things like that. If you go to Jamaica, it's going to be nearly on impossible to source that. And I mentioned, as a result of a lot of these kind of broken families that left the Caribbean and came to Britain, when they came
Mm-hmm.
to Britain, not only were they seen by the people in Britain as just like one homogenous group, because they kind of tended to come on the same boats, it was within those kind of dispersed groups that they kind of communed together and became this like singular community, where you'd have a mixture of these different foods on the same menus, and you'd have parties and dances where they played reggae and ska, but also soca and calypso,
Mm-hmm.
um, which has meant that they kind of all became conflated, sort of as one. But because Jamaica overwhelmingly sent the vast majority of people to Britain, it just so happened that most people came to just assume that this was all just Jamaican culture. And it kind of had this effect of overshadowing the cultures of a lot of the other places in the Caribbean.
Wow. Wow. That is amazing. So let's talk about the journey to create each of these books.
Mhm.
Obviously, you were on the ground, taking photos, really digging in. Talk a little bit about that process.
Yeah, it was after wrote Betty Four and kind of listened to all these hundreds of chefs and people just wax lyrical about where they were from. It's impossible to just not want to go there yourself,
Mhm.
and especially with the family as well, who they may not go back for decades, but they still talk about it every day. And it's just the way that they kind of paint those vivid stories that makes you really want to just see it and experience it for yourself.
Mhm.
And that's kind of that was it for me, really. I started seeing a few other people of my kind of generation and friendship group go back for the first time, or back for the longest time. And I'd been a bunch of times to Jamaica myself
Mhm.
as a kid, but never by myself and never without family, never like exploring the island for myself.
Right.
And so I'd say, I can't even remember the year now. It must have been 2017 or 18. I just decided I was going to move there.
Okay.
Yeah, so that was it basically. I kind of moved there with no real idea. I just went. Fortunately, at the time, Jamaica had changed their passport and citizenship laws, so they made it that you didn't have to have a parent who was born there. It could be your grandparent who was born there,
Okay.
and if you could prove your direct lineage with just like a passport and birth certificate, you could get citizenship and a passport yourself as a grandchild.
Mhm.
And so my parents are actually both born in England, so they yeah, I had to do it through my grandparents,
Well, that was
and I
good
was able to,
timing.
yeah, so I was able to just go to an office in St. Anne, which is one of the parishes in Jamaica.
Mhm.
But the fortunate thing about getting the Jamaican passport is it's part of this CC, like Caribbean community.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the same as like a kind of European Union passport where you have free movement to move and roam
Nice.
around in that region and like kind of work for an extended amount of time. So once I got that passport, it was kind of like,
You had your
yeah, it
golden
was like go
ticket, huh?
time. Yeah, pretty
Yeah,
much.
you had your golden ticket. So, was there anything that you discovered now that you're there an extensive amount of time versus just visiting as a child, right?
Hmm.
Was there some new discoveries now that you are really, really, really into the day to day?
I wouldn't say there was new discoveries,
Okay.
but what I would say is that for all for all the talk and reading and visualization that you hear about what it means to sow and reap these foods
Hmm.
and the toil in the sun that it takes to transport these foods around and for it to get from seed to growth to in the pot to on the plate. It's there's no words that can really describe or set the scene for just how much work it takes to grow a lot of these foods.
Hmm.
And I think that really helped me understand people's like reverence towards this food was the work that goes into it. All the pumpkins again, the dasheen, the cassava, these hard foods, and then on top of that, seeing it literally come out of the soil, be dusted off, chopped up, and go straight into the pot is something that I'd never really ever seen. And for me to see that in person and then taste the food was just like a real eye opener because for a lot of times here in the UK, we're relying on canned goods, frozen stuffs, uh, things that in the end are still good, but they're never going to taste as good as that freshness. And so that was the
Absolutely.
real eye opener for me.
Wonderful. And so then from Jamaica, you went to where? Where was let's talk about just no matter when you went, Trinidad and Tobago. Let's talk about that
Hmm.
experience over there.
So that was the same thing. So these were all kind of separate trips. Jamaica was like a few
Mhm.
trips that occurred before the pandemic and shortly after.
Mhm.
And then separately, again, I'd gone to Trinidad and Tobago and to stay. I used to work in a roti shop in North London.
Okay.
And so my boss there, who's like a kind of older family friend type figure, has a cousin who lives in a place called Pinau.
Mhm.
And so he is a food vendor. He makes and sells like sweets. And so he was really connected into the land and growing food and the food community there. So I was with him a lot of times. And then I stayed on a farm in a place called Maruga, which is deep down to the south of Trinidad, like way on the south
Okay.
coast, which people they call country. So you got like town, which is the capital city of like Port in Spain,
Mhm.
and you got
Mhm.
country like real country, like Maruga was what they call it. Even though it's ironic because the actual distance between the two of them is really not that far, especially if you're an American and you're used to like American driving distances.
Mhm.
To get from the north to the south of Trinidad is 2 3 hours max, I think.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's
Wow.
nothing.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
it feels worlds apart, the different atmospheres of the different places.
Mhm.
And Trinidad was slightly more, I'd say, revelationary to me, simply because that was more so like extended family who are from there. So a lot of it was learning stuff for the first time, really seeing certain dishes cooked for the first time, and just kind of dealing with this I'd say like quote unquote alternative Caribbean culture.
Mhm.
Because as I mentioned, when you're in the UK, they're all housed under one roof. Whereas when you're actually there, you start to see how purely different they are. And so the biggest gamut between Trinidad and a place like Jamaica is that the ethnic demography of the places are kind of basically entirely different. So
Okay.
a place like Jamaica is about 90% Black
Mhm.
African descendants,
Mhm.
and somewhere like Trinidad is about 30% Black Afro Caribbean, and then also 30% Indo Caribbean.
Okay.
And then Guyana is about 40% Indo-Caribbean and about 30% Black Afro-Caribbean, and then you have mixed Chinese,
Mhm.
European, other white Caribbeans, a much smaller percentage, like 1 or 2%. So that demographic split kind of basically informs the different menus and the different foods that are eaten and the different foods that are mainstream in the different parts of the Caribbean. And I guess we can get into how that occurred.
Right, right. Definitely. Though definitely, the groups that are there definitely influence the culture, influence the food that bubbles up to the top in the country. So definitely for
Hmm.
sure. And then, briefly though, let's talk about Suriname
Hmm.
because I'm starting to just learn a little bit more about the history and the culture of that country as well. So share
Hmm.
a little bit about your experience over there.
Well, Suriname is like really fascinating to me because it's similar to how I think about Brazil
Hmm.
in relation to the United States. And so, like, the United States basically has this label of being like the forefront of the transatlantic slave trade, when
Hmm.
in reality, a magnitude more slaves were delivered to Brazil than they were to the United States of America. And it's this idea that because of the different language barriers between us, we're not able to kind of share these parallel stories
Right.
and kind of really understand and get a grip to how similar the constructs of our societies are. And I mention that because Suriname is basically parallel to Guyana in terms of Guyana was wholly, Guyana's been through a lot of hands, but it's now in its current guise is a remnant of being called British Guyana as it was
Okay.
under control of Britain. And
Mhm.
after the transatlantic slave trade, plantation owners in Guyana wanted a new means of basically cheap to free labor.
Right.
And so what they did was ask England to transport workers from its other protectorates around the world to come and work in these Caribbean fields. And so at the time, the idea was to always, in a way, do like for like. So people who were from hot climates, they just believed could also work in other hot climates.
Okay. Yeah.
And so at the time, their biggest resource that they had was India. And as a result, they kind of rebranded and repackaged slavery into indentured labor. And so these were contracts that people had to agree into. So it wasn't that people were necessarily forced against their will. You could say that they lied or duped people in terms of the conditions and what they were getting themselves into. And so as a result of that, you have this influx of Indian people who came to overwhelmingly Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago. But
Mhm.
Suriname was a Dutch colony,
Right.
and the Dutch did exactly the same thing. At the end of the transatlantic slave trade, the Netherlands' largest protectorate in Asia was Indonesia. And so they did the exact mirror for mirror. They imported Indonesian people, what they
Mm.
would call Javanese people. It's like
Yeah.
the largest island in Indonesia,
Mhm.
to Suriname to work as indentured laborers. And so each Caribbean country is basically made up of the fabric of the different pie chart of ethnic groups that exist. And so Suriname exists as the same kind of melting pot. It's just the ingredients of that melting pot are slightly different in terms of that kind of
Absolutely.
those different influences. So instead of English influences, you have Dutch influences as well as these kind of Indonesian influences as on top of the kind of pre-existing West African influences and also Indian as well. And
It's
so yeah,
interesting, and I'm sorry to interrupt you.
that's all
It's
right.
interesting that you say that. I was just in Toronto recently, and there is a restaurant that is Dutch and Indonesian like snack food. And I just didn't get, until I talked to the owners, of course, but he mentioned that his grandfather was from Indonesia. But now hearing you tell this history is starting to make sense. So
Mhm.
thank you for connecting those dots for me.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's pretty much exactly how I got interested in writing about food, was the way that food could really connect these dots in the menus that are on these walls in every restaurant and every takeout spot.
Mhm.
tells so much stories in itself. And of course, in a place like London, where I'd say people are quite adventurous in the foods that they eat. People are always looking for new foods, and there's a kind of
Mhm.
heightened awareness around the kind of history and stories and politics around food that I saw that as a more kind of enticing avenue to tell these stories rather than kind of going down the academic lane.
Yes, definitely, definitely. So on a as you're telling these stories and your work is getting out there, what are you seeing though in terms of how Caribbean cuisine is being portrayed? There's often a lot of talk, especially around when it comes to like Michelin awards and things like that,
Hmm.
to say, what can, Caribbean cuisine or, you know, Bayesian cuisine or whatever, just any of those that are non-French and foo-foo-ish in a sense, how can the food is good, it's authentic, it can deliver the experience and all of that, but will it ever qualify for a Michelin star based on whatever their criteria is? So I guess my question to you, is what is this perception that you're seeing as you're telling these stories about Caribbean cuisine that someone else is telling, um, that the narrative needs to be changed about it, that you're not hearing enough about it, or they've got the wrong perception about it? Are there some narratives out there that you wanted to change in your work, through your work?
Yeah, I'd say the most rudimentary example is that people just think it's hot and spicy. They just think
Mhm.
that all Caribbean food is hot and spicy,
Mhm.
which to me it kind of means nothing. There's like no nuance to that.
Right.
Um, yeah, people just tend to put these super simplistic labels on it, and then of course that removes any chance of it ever being seen in any kind of sophisticated light.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and for me, I think it's like the change basically always stems from within, and the hard work that the people with a vision to portray their food kind of work really hard to say, hey, like this is our food, but it can also be done at a different level. It can also be quote unquote elevated or displayed in different ways, and or the heritage of the foods can be used to reimagine